Welcome to the channel, folks. My name's Johnny, and I review some of the best and worst movies ever made. If they're one of the best, I try to convey what I think makes them one of the best, but if they're one of the worst, I try to get a laugh out of them. Some days it can be challenging trying to find humor in the bad movies, but today isn't one of those days.
The Black Demon's a 2023 horror thriller written by Boise Escada, directed by Adrian Grunberg, and it stars Josh Lucas, Fernanda Urejola, and Julio Cesar Cedillo.
Some people think The Black Demon makes for an entertaining evening's viewing, while other people thought the directing was woeful and the special effects team were obviously being sarcastic. Let's take a quick look at the movie's plot and we can decide if The Black Demon is the kind of catch you'd be better off tossing back into the filthy, blood-soaked ocean.
The movie opens with a diver named Nacho and his sidekick coordinating an underwater repair on a dilapidated oil rig. When Nacho backward rolls into the water, you might think he'd accidentally dropped into Tim Burton's Batman set, but unfortunately, he hasn't. After a totally random psychedelic underwater trip they never explain, Nacho's gobbled up by something we're not shown. Then the same unseen thing eats the boat. And both fellas looked pretty panicked, which isn't very manly. If a shark tried swimming past me to scare me, I'd have been all like... And then we meet Paul Sturgis and his wife Ines and their children Audrey and Tommy. Paul's played by Josh Lucas, who's a bit of a strange one in my books. Since 1993, he's appeared in nearly 70 movies, and to my mind, he's never stood out at a single one of them. But maybe that's just me. In this movie, Paul works for the Nixon Oil Company, and he's heading to a small Mexican town in Baja, California to check out El Diamante, which is the dilapidated oil rig we saw in the opening scene. Paul's decided to bring his family along to make a vacation out of the short trip. Paul hasn't seen the rig in years, and he's shocked to see the town in ruins when they arrive. When he tries mingling with some of the stereotyped locals, he finds out the oil rigs destroyed the town, and he's not as welcomed as he'd anticipated being. After bribing the locals, they direct Paul and his family towards the dock he'll be departing from. Like a lot of the movies I've reviewed lately, Audrey the daughter hates everything despite having everything a young girl could ever ask for. And Tommy, the 7-year-old, speaks exactly like your least favorite grandfather, and he is probably just as interesting. Paul arranges a boat to go out to the rig while his family waits for him to get back. And I recognize the ferryman, Chocolatito, the instant they got into the water, but I didn't know where from at first. On the way out, Chocolatito tells Paul the oil rig's woken up the Black Demon and that things are very bad at the minute. So bad, in fact, he refuses to take Paul all the way out. Right when Paul's shifting into the other boat, Chocolatito's accent finally registered with me. It is none other than Hector Jimenez, who played Esqueleto in Nacho Libre, which was a fantastically funny, poignant, touching movie based on a true story about a real-life Mexican Catholic priest named Sergio Gutierrez Benitez, who financially supported an entire orphanage by himself for 23 years as a lucha libre wrestler.
And why am I going off about Nacho Libre when I'm meant to be reviewing The Black Demon? It's just so I can increase the chances that you take away something positive from this review.
Esqueleto tags Paul out and heads back to the shore while Paul makes his way to the rig. Meanwhile, back on dry land, young Tommy spends an uncanny amount of time reading information from his tablet to the audience about the local legend the movie's based on. Then, the cartoon cutout Mexican bandito character tries making intimate advances on Ines and Audrey. So she rightfully smashes a bottle over his head, and this forces them to commandeer a local man's boat to get them out to Paul at the rig. Right around the same time, Paul's pulling up to the rig, and it's disgusting looking. They've computer colored all the water red and black, but the special effects artist must not be familiar with the idea that oceans have currents, so the water surrounding the rig looks like a big stationary plate of dirty jello. When he arrives, he's attacked by two of the oil rig workers named Chado and Junior. They tell Paul everyone else is dead, and before the conversation gets any further, they hear Paul's family off in the distance in a boat of their own. That sends Chado and Junior into a panic, even though they didn't even notice when Paul arrived a moment ago. And they start smacking the rig with hammers to distract the enormous shark from the incoming boat, and it appears to work, which is confusing considering the shark's meant to be a genius. Then young Audrey takes a header into the water because of course she does. She finds herself in a very big pot of human appendage soup. And if you thought the idea of a load of human limbs floating about fully intact in a saltwater ocean full of hungry sea creatures was laughable, you would not be wrong. But as somebody with insider information about how this movie plays out, I'd recommend you take whatever action you can get at this stage. They yank Audrey back out of the water. When she tells them about the dead bodies, her parents completely dismiss her for absolutely no reason at all. Then they have to watch on as the selfless man who brought the family out's devoured by our titular demonillo negro on his way back. Then Innes says that man was trying to help us and he didn't deserve to die like that. And remember, she said that. If that scene hasn't prompted you to change the channel already, perhaps the next line of dialogue will.
Jesus Christ.
No. The Black Demon.
I admittedly got a bit skeptical when I first saw this scene, so I paused the movie and broke out my calculator and ruler. Just for your reference, Jaws was approximately 25 feet long, which is massive in terms of shark size. And according to my trusty calculator, which I admit might not be trusty at all, in relation to the boat, which I conservatively estimated to be around 15 feet, the strapping young shark in this movie is somewhere between 75 and 90 feet long. And I'm just going to leave that info there, along with this still image, so you can understand my tone for the rest of the review.
Back inside, they make the kids some hot cocoa because what else are you going to give them to help with the PTSD? Tequila would be absurd. It's not that kind of movie. Shadow gets everyone up to speed, and half the crew escaped and half the crew died in the attempt. The radios haven't worked for weeks, and nothing's really worked for weeks. And for reasons nobody addresses, none of the crew members who made it back safely to shore ever sent help back to get them. And Paul learns the rig's been leaking oil for months, and Shadow and Junior are furious nobody from head office ever replied to their requests for help. And Paul keeps quiet because he's the man who's been signing off on the rig's safety papers. Then Paul and his wife ponder what it was they just saw out there. Because for some reason, these kinds of movies, when something takes on gigantic dimensions, instead of simply being a gigantic shark, it somehow becomes unrecognizable. But Shadow tells him it's much more than a shark, it's actually a curse.
And that specific comment marks the exact moment this movie lost my respect. But at least we made it to the 40-minute point, I guess. Skinamarink had me sleeping before the 10-minute mark on both viewings. In reality, the actual legend of the Black Demon, aka El Demonio Negro. Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm suddenly Luciano Pavarotti. It's meant to be a metaphorical representation of the environmental consequences we human beings are bringing onto ourselves by allegedly destroying the planet, which in and of itself is kind of a cool concept.
But instead of Quint's epic monologue from the dark bowels of the ill-fated orca in Jaws, Shadow's 3-minute lecture takes the interesting idea of this massive shark and turns it into a long-winded string of political catchphrases. In screenwriting terms, one page in a script is generally accepted as being about 1 minute of screen time, and that means they devoted 3 whole pages of this screenplay to lecturing the audience.
I don't do politics on this channel. This is not an environmental statement. But if I wanted all this stuff shouted at me, I wouldn't pay to see the latest horror thriller. I'd voluntarily subject myself to one of Greta Thunberg's free hypocritical rants on YouTube. Uh-oh, maybe I do politics on this channel.
Even though they're all fully aware the gigantic shark will eat them if they go into the water, Junior heads below to do a repair anyway. And when he does the repair, the shark eats him. And when his body floats to the surface, the entire cast gives us a masterclass in overacting with facial expressions. The special effects department shows us a big chunk of the $50 million budget probably ended up padding some executives' pockets, given this amazing rubber dummy. Once they realize he's dead as well, Innes repeats her line from earlier when she says he didn't deserve to die like that because he was trying to help us. Eventually, Paul's overacting and exaggerated facial expressions get so out of hand, Shadow feels compelled to smack him. And I fully support him in the idea because he absolutely deserved it. And it's been nearly 20 minutes since we've seen the shark, so something had to happen. The impact of the slap sends an idea through Paul's head, so they head into a room that's not even close to looking like it's part of the normal set, and he tells Shadow he's going to do something that sounds impossible. While that's happening, Innes happens to happen upon a stack of paperwork confirming Paul's been signing off on the rig's safety. And if you've not been paying attention because this movie's ghastly in all the wrong ways, this paperwork means everything that's happening is actually Paul's fault. And then it's Tommy's turn to fall in the water because the writer has no imagination. And we get to see this shark again, and we're at the 1 hour and 5 minute point, and on closer inspection, it's actually better we're not seeing the shark, which is a perplexing conclusion to draw in a shark movie. Steven Spielberg famously kept his shark out of view because it looked terrible close up, and to everyone's surprise, it ended up serving the movie perfectly because it allowed the audience members to use their imaginations. But this shark's not a practical effect. It's created entirely on a computer. That means they can decide exactly how they want it to look, and that makes their choices all the more baffling. Innes dives in head first and rescues her son, and right when we all get excited at the prospect of her being pulled back into the water and torn to bits, nothing happens. Instead, we're treated to another domestic argument back on the boat, which is great, because everyone knows domestic arguments are the cornerstone to every great shark movie. Down below, Paul's acting combined with some seriously bizarre camera angles and an environmental imagery montage actually makes me stop watching the movie.
I never leave a movie without finishing it. Ever. But The Black Demon made me take a walk in the rain at 11:30 on a Sunday night. And this teaches us that there's a first time for everything, folks.
For the next 20 minutes, everybody faffs about, and Paul decides he needs to atone for his sins by dying in the process of blowing up the shark. And in this scene, we watch as he tries to sneak into the water without even telling his wife what he's doing. And I know that sounds absurd, but what's even better is when he tells her his plan, she's totally okay with it. So he heads down below to get geared up, and Shadow tells him he's wearing the last oxygen tank and it is practically empty. So Paul says,
I'll make it work.
There's hardly any oxygen in it. We human beings need to take oxygen with us when we're going underwater. What the hell does "I'll make it work" mean? Could somebody please tell me how these writers keep getting jobs?
Then, as he's getting ready to go, he tells Shadow, a man he's only just met, to look after his family, and his own family too. Then he says goodbye to his wife like he's heading to the store for cheese slices, and then he rips off Terminator 2. And while he's down below, the family and Shadow row their rubber dinghy out through the blood and the guts and the crude oil towards sweet, sweet freedom. But they're not getting off that easily, because Paul gives them a goodbye speech through an underwater radio that lasts even longer than the environmental rant did. Then he times a bomb on its own timer perfectly to go off in the shark's stomach when it swallows him. And if you take a second to really think about the odds against him lining all that up, given he's underwater and he's relying on the behaviors of an elusive wild animal, you might start hating the writer as much as I do. But then Escalito comes back to give them a lift home, and that makes me all happy again.
And there you have it, folks, the plot to The Black Demon. Now let's take a look at the good bit section. Notice I said section.
If I feel a movie's failed to demonstrate it has any good bits, I've skipped this section completely in the past or I've made a joke out of it. But I'm going to resist the temptation to do that today. And instead, I'll explain what I look for when I'm considering the good bits and the shite bits sections. My criteria has always been fairly standard. Was the story compelling? Were the characters memorable? Did the movie feel authentic? How were the visuals and cinematography? Was the soundtrack memorable? Was the acting decent? Was the story well paced? Did it have an underlying theme, and if so, how did they convey it? Now, if I just run through these one at a time, the Black Demon story was not engaging and it failed to hold my attention. The characters were underdeveloped and I wasn't emotionally invested in any of them. The movie felt no more authentic or believable or realistic than any of the Sharknado series, even though it was taking itself completely seriously. In terms of visuals and cinematography, they somehow managed to cover up the natural beauty of the Baja region of California California with clunky CGI and green screen effects. The camera angles jump back and forth between stock or weird and experimental, so they fail to enhance the viewing experience in any way. I don't recall there being a soundtrack. The acting felt like a collection of Amdram participants taking part in a community fundraiser. There wasn't any pacing I was aware of, and if you consider screaming an environmental message directly into the camera for so long the audience feels uncomfortable a theme, then The Black Demon is dripping with it. I respect all of you way too much to waste your time reversing everything I've just explained in the good bit section. Suffice it to say, unfortunately, this is another one this year that falls into the category of no redeeming qualities. It's essentially a shark horror thriller movie with no sharks or horror or thrills. And it talks down to you about things you aren't responsible for as a decent, hard-working individual. And that's that. So, should you watch The Black Demon? Or should you toss the DVD into the shark-infested waters saturated with perfectly preserved human appendages where it belongs?
Come on. Until next time, folks. It's me, Johnny, from that video you just loved, and I know you loved it because you're still here, and seeing as you are still here, you should probably go down there and smash me in the face to subscribe, and seeing as you just smashed me in the face, you should probably do something nice to make up for it, like maybe watching this next video. Do it!